right, here we go. The Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing without objection so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection so ordered. And as a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. I am pleased to call this hearing today to discuss rail safety as well as the events that occurred in East Palestine. I am hopeful every member has had ample opportunity to review the NTSB final report and the pending bipartisan legislation in both the Senate and in the House. The Railroad Safety Enhancement Act, or RISA, that I introduced with Congressman Moulton builds upon the bipartisan legislation our Senate colleagues marked up and passed favorably out of Commerce Committee. First, it requires all Class I railroads to enroll in the confidential close call reporting system for a period of 2 years. This program is run by an independent third party and allows railroad employees to report close calls and unsafe incidents. Second, our legislation does not include the periodic rail car inspections included in the Senate Rail Safety Bill. It was well-intentioned, but I believe after discussions from a wide variety of stakeholders that these were redundant and just not necessary, unnecessary. Our legislation requires state DOTs to notify first responders of the existence of the Ask Rail app, which is a tool that provides real-time data to first responders about a train consist, the makeup, all the stuff about the train. The first responders in East Palestine had issues accessing the Ask Rail app due to a lack of connectivity. Our bill creates an Ask Rail connectivity pilot program to fill gaps in service for the app along the national freight network. Folks, people came to East Palestine, volunteer firemen, they get to the scene, they have no connectivity, they don't even know what's inside the cars. We got to fix that, and our legislation does that. Our legislation authorizes an additional $1 billion for the Railroad Crossing Elimination Grant Program, $1 billion. I'll quote Ms. Hamidi, "Grade crossings are among the deadliest spaces in our rail system, in part because they are where our rail and highway systems meet. Better separating these systems would save thousands of lives and incur many other benefits," end quote. I believe the American people would value federal investment in this area. It will not only reduce congestion on the network, but it will also save lives. Finally, our legislation authorizes $100 million annually for the Federal Railroad Administration to establish a grant program to install onboard freight railcar telematics systems and gateway devices. The purpose of the program is to outfit the new and existing freight railcars carrying hazardous material. Additionally, this program will provide shippers with real-time data about their tank cars' health and performance. The bill also contains compromises on the phase-out of the DOT 111 tank cars that industry has indicated that they can meet. The Senate opted to introduce rail safety legislation in the immediate aftermath of the derailment in East Palestine. Now, while the House, what did we choose to do? We chose to wait for the NTSB's final report. Now, before I move any further, my Republican colleagues. I need to speak to my Republican colleagues. The Railway Safety Act in the Senate is supported by President Trump and is authored by Vice Presidential nominee Senator Vance. Representative Moulton and I took that bill and we added 4 key safety components: the confidential close call reporting system, Ask Rail connectivity pilot program, the telematics, to modernize the tank car fleet, and more funding for the Railroad Crossing Elimination Grant Program. Taking Senator Vance's bill and adding these 4 safety provisions makes this a very good rail safety bill, and I humbly ask for your support because it's the right thing to do. I have read every page of the East Palestine Final Report and reports related to other derailments and tragic incidents across the rail network. The idea that we do not evolve in the safety realm is indefensible. I extended invites to several of the Class 1 railroad CEOs. It was my intention that they would use this opportunity to discuss the positive policies their companies have undertaken in the area of safety. Some of these railroads, they have good stories to tell. I have personally visited several of them. I visited CN's operation in Homewood, Illinois, and it was top tier. The types of technologies they are developing are state-of-the-art and will save lives, and I commend them for their efforts. But we can do more. I'm eager to listen to the witnesses today, and I look forward to asking the panel questions. I now recognize Ranking Member Ms. Wilson for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for convening this important hearing. The safety of freight and passenger railroads and the communities that they travel through should be our top priority on this subcommittee. The Norfolk Southern train derailment in East Palestine shocked the nation, but we cannot lose sight that there have been over 1,500 rail incidents since then. In my district in Florida, collisions between cars and trains remain a persistent problem. While technological solutions to improve rail safety exist, it is clear that railroading's overall safety culture has room to improve. My top priority has always been rail safety, and I'm thankful that our chair has made it a priority with this legislation alongside other members of this committee, Representatives Moulton, Representative Sykes, and DeLuzio. I hope the information from today's hearing will encourage us to mark up this legislation and send a bipartisan rail safety bill to the floor. No transportation accident has a single cause. The NTSB's report on the Norfolk Southern derailment makes it clear that there were many causes of the derailment, and the decision to vent and burn vinyl chloride under the mistaken belief that the tank cars were in imminent danger of exploding. According to the report, 26% of cars that did not derail had reportable defects despite being inspected before departure. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about what railroading practices need to change to catch defects like these. In the year and a half since the derailment, many media outlets have reported that carmen have had less than 90 seconds to inspect a rail car or have been pressured to release cars known to be defective. Fortunately, after the derailment, the train in East Palestine had 2 crew members and 1 trainee on board who were able to respond swiftly to the accident and derailment. Thanks to their quick actions, they moved the locomotive away from the fire, preventing additional fires and dangers to the first responders and the surrounding community. If only 1 person had been on board, they would not have been able to do that so quickly. So I'm glad to see that Chairman Neal's legislation ensures 2-person crews. I'm also concerned by the NTSB's findings that despite having bearing detectors placed on an average of every 15 miles prior to the derailment site, the crew did not know that the bearing was in danger of failure before the train derailed in East Palestine. Expanding the use of hot bearing detectors will only improve rail if the detectors are active, and the spacing gives sufficient time to stop a faulty train before a catastrophic failure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes for an opening.
Thank you, Chair Nels and Ranking Member Wilson, for holding today's hearing on rail safety. Ensuring safety in every mode of transportation should always be this committee's top priority. Since the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, committee Democrats have been calling for a rail safety hearing and rail safety legislation. In May of 2023, every T&I Democrat signed a letter asking for a rail safety hearing, highlighting the dozens of outstanding rail safety recommendations from the National Transportation Safety Board. Now that the NTSB has issued its final report on the derailment, Subcommittee Chair Nels, along with committee Democrats, Representatives Moulton, Sykes, and DeLuzio, have introduced rail safety legislation. Today's hearing is an opportunity to hear a variety of perspectives on the NTSB's final report, which includes more than 30 additional rail safety recommendations, several of which require congressional action. Nearly a year and a half ago, we all watched as the giant plume of toxic fumes was released into the sky after the Norfolk Southern derailment. Fortunately, no one died as a result of the derailment, but it remains a stark reminder of why we need to be vigilant about rail safety. That's why T&I Democrats held a rail safety roundtable in March to hear from communities and rail workers impacted by rail accidents. Mayor Frank Moran of Hiram, Georgia, told members that legislation concerning blocked crossings would help his community. National League of Cities Executive Director Clarence Anthony told members that thousands of communities across the country support common sense rail safety legislation. Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen National Legislative Representative Vince Verna expressed concern that the freight railroads continue to pile on to the tally of rail accidents and derailments. Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation Workers International Representative Peter Kennedy said Congress needs to make freight rail safety a priority because meaningful change is needed in the industry. And Anna Sevidas, an owner of a small business in East Palestine, Ohio, highlighted how this dangerous derailment devastated her community. Meanwhile, rail safety accidents and incidents continue to occur. Over the last decade, the trends have not improved. In Washington State alone, there are 193 train accidents, 71 grade crossing incidents, and 167 railroad right-of-way trespasser fatalities over the last 5 years, including a Burlington Road Santa Fe derailment that spilled over 3,000 gallons of diesel fuel on the Swinomish Indian Reservation in March of 2023. While trains are getting longer, freight railroads continue to shrink their workforce. From 2015 to 22, Class 1 railroads laid off 55% of mechanical employees, 44% of locomotive repair employees, and 43% of rail car repair employees. And in 2023, there were 114 more rail accidents than in 22. So I look forward to this committee passing legislation to address rail safety concerns. The Rail Safety Enhancement Act contains the language that passed out of the Senate Commerce Committee last May. It addresses NTSB recommendations to expand the high hazard flammable trains definition, establish requirements for wayside bearing defect detectors, and accelerate the removal of DOT 111 tank cars from flammable liquids service. The bill also provides needed funding for hazardous materials emergency responder training. And importantly, it mandates the Class 1 railroads to join the Federal Railroad Administration's confidential close call reporting system. And the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, BIL, supercharged investment in rail with $102 billion in planned funding. Many of these investments will improve safety, along with making service improvements. And last year, the city of Blaine in my district, for instance, received a $9.5 million RAISE grant to begin work on the Bell Road BNSF at-grade crossing. That town can now begin to resolve the issues at the crossing that I first heard about more than 20 years ago as a freshman member of the House of Representatives. And I'm pleased that project is advancing to improve safety and accessibility, reduce congestion, create jobs, and keep the regional economy moving. The BIL also includes $3 billion to separate or close grade crossings through the Railroad Crossing Elimination Grant Program and $5 billion to enhance the safety, efficiency, and reliability of rail through the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement, or CRISI, grant program. I expect great results for communities from these grants and additional rail funding to come, but there is more to do. So I thank the chair, I thank the ranking member, and the witnesses, including our new member of the House of Representatives from Ohio. I look forward to hearing all their testimony. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I'd like now to recognize our witnesses and thank them for being here today. Take a moment to explain our lighting system. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means you're running out of time, and red conclude your remarks. I ask unanimous consent that the witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection, so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such a time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by the members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, we will turn to our first panel. And Rep. Rulli from the great state of Ohio, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Thank you. Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for allowing me to testify on this critical issue of rail safety. Let me be clear. The state of our rail safety is a global disgrace. With Norfolk Southern train derailed in East Palestine, just 16 miles from my home, President Biden was nowhere to be found. When Secretary Buttigieg commented on his behalf, 10 days after the fact, he blew off the situation by saying, there are roughly 1,000 cases a year of train derailing. 1,000 derailments a year? That is pure government negligence. The East Palestine disaster wasn't an isolated incident. It was a wake-up call that I heard, but fell on deaf ears everywhere in the government. Derailments are not limited to just one state or company, and issues with rail safety are not limited to derailments. Some other tragic incidents that we have seen since February 3rd, 2023 include the death of Louis Schuster, a Norfolk Southern conductor killed switching operations in Cleveland, Ohio, March of 2023. The death of Danny Brent Wilkins, a Union Pacific track worker killed while making track repairs in Arkansas, of April 2024. Class 1 railroads are asleep at the switch while our communities live in fear that each passing train could be the next disaster. This is unacceptable. The consequences of inaction are not limited to human cost, but also financial. In the year since February 23rd, 2023, Norfolk Southern's costs tied to the derailment are estimated at over $1.1 billion. That's billion with a B. And that doesn't even include the meager settlement agreed to by the Department of Justice. Who ultimately pays for this? The American people, through increased costs of goods shipped over these rail networks. When my neighbors are already paying for the disaster with their health, I've seen their rashes. I've listened to their stories of their doctor's visits, told to me with scratchy voices and sore throats. This is a slap in all of their faces. The National Transportation Safety Board, under Chair Jennifer Homidy's leadership, has made 27 recommendations to rail companies that remained unfulfilled to this day. One of these could have saved the conductor's life in Cleveland, a simple cage on the front of the cart to protect against collisions, yet it remains unimplemented. Another recommends Norfolk Southern ensure all relative expertise regarding hazmat on board is shared with on-scene responders. Oxyvinyl manufactured the chemicals on board the train in East Palestine. They recommended not to vent and burn the contents of the train, but this recommendation wasn't shared with first responders until after the fact. A third recommends Norfolk Southern immediately provide first responders with an accurate list of materials on board. It took them a full hour to provide this to East Palestine, putting those first responders at extreme risk. Many of these 27 recommendations are included in Chairman Nell's H.R. 8996, which is a bipartisan effort that should appeal to anyone who recognizes the NTSB's critical role in transportation safety. You may be wondering why Chairman Nels, myself, and many other co-sponsored introduced this bill. We are doing it because Class 1 railroads can't be trusted to do it on their own. NTSB recommendation R26 was issued over a decade ago in response to a head-on collision in Oklahoma. It urged Class 1 railroads to install audio and image recordings with a minimum of 12-hour recording capability. The NTSB reiterated the importance of this recommendation in a June letter on the East Palestine disaster. That train had a 12-hour recording capability. However, Norfolk Southern overwrote that, but only provided 20 minutes surrounding the derailment itself. With Norfolk Southern controlling a quarter of this nation's rail network, this disregard for safety recommendations is just purely unacceptable. We must take decisive action to ensure the safety and security of this nation's rail networks by passing H.R. 8996. This bill has been co-sponsored by 9 members and counting, and includes many parts of Senator Vance and Senator Brown's already vetted S-576. This bill requires DOT to issue regulations so shippers must provide first responders with advance notice of hazardous trains. Establish requirements for wayside detectors. Require a minimum 2-man crew on certain freight trains. In my opinion, this is the most important words out of my mouth today. Create hazardous material emergency preparedness fund. Provide funds for telematics and gateway devices. Phase out certain flawed tank cars like those that derailed in East Palestine by May 21st, 2027, giving them lead time to make this happen. Require Amtrak and all Class 1 railroads to enroll a confidential close call reporting system. Provide funds to study the 20 most frequently blocked crossing in at least 10 states. These aren't suggestions. These are imperatives. Employing a second crewman in cab provides a necessary layer of defense against potential disasters. And we as legislators must now act as that second crewman in protecting the American people from inaction of rail companies and the administration. The cost of inaction is way too high. We've seen the economic disruption and the environmental damage and the threat to human life. My community has seen it firsthand. I personally arrived at Ground Zero 18 hours after the train derailment in East Palestine. The impact was immediate and personal. Every single time I left that site, I had a sore throat. And to this day, right now, today, my family that lives 15 miles apart are still using bottled water. The effects of this disaster are not abstract. They're part of our daily lives in East Palestine. How many more residents need to be displaced? How many more people need to lose their lives before we say enough is enough? Our nation's railroad network used to be the crowning achievement of American industry. It once was hailed as a marvel of innovation, completed with a gold spike, offering the promise of a brighter and more prosperous future, but now simply exists as a nightmare in the minds, the backyards of the millions of Americans. I urge this committee to take decisive action, hold the Class 1 railroads and the Department of Transportation accountable, demand stricter regulations and enforcement. Our communities can't afford to wait. The next train derailment could be in your own neighborhood. By all of us supporting H.R. 8996, we're not only improving, but we're also acknowledging the vital work of the NTSB and Chairman Hamady. This is our chance to take meaningful, bipartisan action on a critical issue affecting every state and every district in the United States. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rep. Rulli. Any other questions? Any questions? Seeing none, thank you. I want to thank you for being here. This concludes our first panel. You are excused, sir. I would like to now welcome our second panel of witnesses. As a reminder, your written testimony has been made part of the record, so the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, Chair Hamady, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Since 1967, the National Transportation Safety Board has been at the forefront of railroad safety. While our investigation of the East Palestine derailment has garnered significant attention, we launch to rail accidents almost weekly. This past Saturday, we sent a team to Norfolk, Virginia, to investigate an accident involving a Norfolk Southern conductor who sustained severe injuries during switching operations in a rail yard. Last March, a Norfolk Southern conductor was killed when the train collided with a dump truck at a grade crossing in Cleveland. The conductor was riding the lead rail car during a shoving movement when he was pinned between the rail car and the dump truck during the collision. A Union Pacific employee was also killed during a shoving movement just a few weeks ago, this time in an Illinois rail yard. The NTSB has issued multiple recommendations urging railroads and the FRA to prevent employees from riding rail cars during certain movements. Those recommendations remain open, meaning they have not been addressed. In fact, we have 215 open recommendations that will transform rail safety, but only if they're acted on. According to the railroad's own data, the accident rate in rail yards has soared more than 50% over the last decade, reaching levels we haven't seen since 2005. And over half of our open rail investigations involve employee injuries, some of which were fatal, all of which are unacceptable and preventable. I urge this committee to exercise robust oversight over rail employee safety, which is clearly at risk. Turning to East Palestine, we determined that the probable cause of the derailment and hazmat release was the failure of a wheel bearing that overheated and caused the axle to separate, derailing 38 cars of the train. 11 of those cars contained hazmat. 3 were mechanically breached, releasing their contents that ignited. All of those mechanically breached tank cars were DOT 111s. We determined the massive fire likely began with the release of a flammable liquid from a punctured DOT 111 tank car, which is not scheduled for replacement until May 2029. Other DOT 111s that breached were transporting combustible liquids. Those aren't covered under the FAST Act. And this is a vital finding I want to drive home. We determined that if those DOT 111 tank cars had not sustained mechanical breaches during the derailment, the DOT 105 tank cars transporting vinyl chloride likely would not have been exposed to the fire conditions that led to the concerns about polymerization and ultimately the vent and burn actions in East Palestine. We also determined that Norfolk Southern failed to provide responders with information on the contents of the rail cars for hours. This not only delayed the evacuation of residents, but prolonged firefighters' exposures to extremely hazardous conditions. They couldn't rely on the placards, which had melted, and only one responder we interviewed was able to access Ask Rail. Complicating matters, there are restrictions in Ohio for training volunteer firefighters, many of whom bravely responded despite having received minimal training. Radio communications were a significant challenge. 48 agencies responded and struggled to communicate with each other. And importantly, we determined that Norfolk Southern failed to communicate relevant expertise and dissenting opinions to the incident commander. They also inaccurately represented that the tank cars were at risk of a catastrophic failure, which created unwarranted urgency and led to the unnecessary decision to vent and burn the 5 vinyl chloride tank cars. As a result of this investigation, we issued 37 findings and 34 new safety recommendations, all of which Norfolk Southern has endorsed. Thank you, Chairman Nels and committee members, for your rail safety leadership. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman Hamady. Administrator Bowles, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member Wilson. and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on improving railroad safety. I want to pause to remember Representative Payne, who was a champion for making freight and passenger rail safe, reliable, and accessible. I join in remembering him fondly. Today, I am pleased to join you to discuss rail safety. FRA works every day to advance safety, our core mission, through our safety professionals, partnerships with stakeholders, and investments in rail projects around the country. The Department of Transportation safety personnel were on the ground within hours of the Norfolk Southern derailment in East Palestine and have been investigating the accident. Last week, FRA reported on our investigation, which found a roller bearing overheated and failed, causing the derailment. FRA also determined that NS's procedures and inadequate staffing for communicating information from the hot bearing detectors to the train crew may have contributed to the accident. And FRA, in consultation with the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, concluded that the use of a general-purpose DOT 111 specification tank car to transport butyl acrylate contributed to the severity of the accident. In response to the derailment, Secretary Buttigieg laid out a three-part push, pressing the major railroads and inviting Congress to join us in the efforts to increase freight rail safety and hold railroads accountable. For over a year, the Department of Transportation has continued those calls while concurrently taking important actions to make freight rail safer. For instance, FRA conducted 7,500 focused inspections on high-hazard flammable train routes and began collecting train length data. FRA deployed billions of dollars for rail improvement and safety projects, including 63 projects that address more than 400 grade crossings through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law's Railroad Crossing Elimination Grant Program. FRA also began collecting information from crews and dispatchers at 2 Class 1 freight railroads through pilots of the C3RS program. And work continues with FRA's Wayside Detector Railroad Safety Advisory Committee Working Group. I am encouraged to see the renewed bipartisan interest in this chamber for legislation that would add to these safety actions. While FRA will continue using our existing authorities, we need Congress to do its part. Because data shows that the Class 1 freight railroad safety performance has stagnated over the last decade, and by some measures deteriorated. For yard derailments, data show that the rate in 2023 was 51% higher compared to 10 years ago. While the deterioration of derailment rates has not been uniform, recent data does show one Class 1 freight railroad experiencing an improvement in reductions of derailments during 2023. The overall rate of accidents not at grade crossings has been rising slowly throughout the decade, peaking in 2022. While not all derailments are equal, yard derailments should be taken seriously. Since July 2023, FRA has issued 4 safety bulletins related to rail yard fatalities. Just earlier this month, a conductor lost his life in a rail yard accident. This is neither acceptable nor inevitable, and that's why FRA has been pushing the industry to do better. For instance, FRA has issued 19 safety advisories and safety bulletins calling for attention and action on issues like shove movements, switching cars, wayside detectors, long trains, and roadway maintenance machines. FRA also finalized new safety rules on train crew size, ensuring that crews have emergency escape breathing apparatus, certifying dispatcher and signal employees, and requiring railroads to develop fatigue risk management plans. FRA's made progress on rail safety, but history's shown that the major freight railroads and many in Congress are eager not to settle for the status quo. Like the American public, FRA and DOT think that is unacceptable. I urge all of you and your colleagues in both chambers to act quickly on common sense rail safety measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Administrator Bowles. Deputy Administrator Brown, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Ranking Member Wilson, Ranking Member Larson, members of the subcommittee. Appreciate the opportunity to be here to testify on behalf of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration as it relates to our hazardous materials safety and rail safety programs. As I testified earlier this year before this subcommittee, safety is and remains a top priority of the Secretary, the Department, and our agency. Specifically, PHMSA is responsible for overseeing the safe transportation of hazardous materials by all modes of transportation. That's trucks, trains, planes, automobiles, vessels, drones, which amounts to nearly 1 in 10 goods that are transported commercially in the United States. Everything from nuclear waste to bulk petroleum fuels to lithium-ion batteries to spacecraft being transported to spaceports around the world. With respect to rail transport, to help ensure the safest, most competitive, and environmentally responsible hazardous materials transportation system in the world, PHMSA largely focuses on establishing and updating standards for tank cars and operational requirements for hazardous materials carriage, collaborating with the Federal Railroad Administration in enforcing those standards, investing in research and development, participating in investigations, and establishing requirements for providing information to first responders, as well as providing funding for training those first responders. Because the railroad sector and the global economy are increasingly dynamic and rapidly changing, our challenges as an agency are as difficult as ever. Since joining the agency, I have made it a goal to visit with victims of pipeline and hazardous materials related incidents, from Bellingham, Washington, with Ranking Member, to Satarsha, Mississippi, to Marshall, Michigan, and East Palestine, Ohio. I have heard directly from individuals, from families, from first responders impacted by hazardous materials incidents. And in the case of the 2023 Norfolk Southern derailment, PHMSA personnel were immediately on the ground responding to that incident and supporting the National Transportation Safety Board's investigation. Once much of the initial response was completed, the FRA administrator and I were on scene to support the tank car inspections and to meet with and solicit feedback from the workers and first responders. And also for the first time, the department's History of Secretary of Transportation visited the site of a hazmat train derailment to participate in the hazmat car inspections and meet with investigators and first responders. The brave first responders for this incident were critical in helping us develop major changes to our hazardous materials response regulations for railroads, which we recently announced as part of our new real-time train consist rulemaking. We have known for decades that much stronger design DOT 117 and 105 tank cars reduce safety risk during incidents and we have consistently advocated for their expanded use in rail transport. The NTSB noted in its most recent report that in the vast majority of accidents involving DOT 111 tank cars they examined, the hazardous materials releases likely would have been prevented or reduced by the use of a more robust tank car specification, such as the 117s, which have the thicker tank shell, thermal protection, and consistent use of full-height head shields. In the wake of the 2013 crude oil derailment in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, that killed nearly 50 people and destroyed dozens of buildings, PHMSA and the FRA moved with haste to develop an aggressive and comprehensive high-hazard flammable train rule to, among other things, phase out the DOT 111 tank cars in favor of newer and stronger and much better performing cars. Unfortunately, a 2016 congressional mandate, just months after we finished our work, delayed that phase out of the weaker DOT 111 tank cars. And that remains in place unless Congress acts to change it. Mr. Chairman, I know the Secretary was pleased to hear your support for a quicker phase out, and I echo those sentiments. In closing, PHMSA is eager to work with this subcommittee to advance bipartisan legislation that improves the safety of hazardous materials transportation by rail. The success of our hazardous material safety initiatives depend heavily on the dedicated efforts of PHMSA's hazardous material safety team, who work tirelessly to establish and uphold the highest safety standards in the world. Their commitment is the driving force in executing our agency's crucial role in overseeing the safe transportation of hazardous materials. However, as members of this subcommittee have pointed out, too often action is delayed until after a major incident occurs. PHMSA stands ready to work with you to proactively advance precautionary safety measures. And thank you for your efforts to advance the bipartisan railroad safety legislation before you. We look forward to working with you to improve hazardous material safety to protect our communities. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Sloan, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to join this panel today to discuss rail safety and important lessons from the tragic events related to the East Palestine derailment. The American Chemistry Council shares the committee's goal to advance transportation safety and to protect public health and the environment. We also share your gratitude to the emergency responders, government officials, and rail workers for their tireless efforts responding to the incident. And we thank the NTSB for its thorough investigation. The East Palestine incident is a strong reminder that more work is needed, and ACC is committed to working with Congress, the administration, and all stakeholders to further improve freight rail and hazardous materials transportation safety. ACC represents the leading companies in the business of chemistry. Our members manufacture products that make our lives healthier, safer, and more sustainable. Each year, our industry ships more than 2.3 million carloads by rail. We ship chemicals because the country needs these essential products to support virtually every aspect of daily life. ACC and its members are committed to transporting these products safely. We demonstrate this commitment through Responsible Care, our environmental health, safety, and security performance initiative. In addition, our ChemTrek and TransCare programs provide specialized training and critical information to local emergency responders. While rail is already recognized as the safest way to transport hazardous materials over land, ACC supports a multi-layered approach to further advance safety, including steps to reduce derailments, minimize the risk of hazmat release, and strengthen emergency response. ACC believes that the Bipartisan Railroad Safety Enhancement Act and the Senate Railway Safety Act provide a solid foundation to move us forward. I want to focus on one element of overall rail safety, improving tank car performance. It's important to recognize that shippers, not railroads, own or lease the cars used to ship their products and have made significant investments in tank car safety. ACC members are currently upgrading their tank cars used to transport flammable liquids, replacing DOT 111 cars with cars built to newer DOT 117 standards. These actions require significant long-term planning and capital investment. The FAST Act deadline for the final group of these cars is May 1st, 2029. I want to clarify that prior to the FAST Act, the phase-out requirement applied only to DOT 111 cars carried on high-hazard flammable trains. It would not have applied to the train that derailed in East Palestine. The FAST Act expanded the scope to apply to all flammable liquid cars, regardless of what type of train they are on. ACC supported the FAST Act. ACC also supports establishing an earlier deadline, but it must be consistent with the railcar industry's ability to produce DOT 117 cars while also building, maintaining, and repairing all types of rail cars. Industry data suggests that moving up the current deadline by 1 year may be feasible. ACC believes that the Nels-Moulton bill provides a workable approach. While it accelerates the deadline, it also recognizes that an unworkable phase-out timeline could disrupt critical supply chains. Therefore, the bill asks the GAO to review industry capacity and authorizes DOT to extend the time frame if necessary. I'd like to briefly touch on two other aspects of the House bill. First, ACC strongly supports additional funding for PHMSA's Hazardous Materials Grants Program. The program supports emergency response planning and training activities and is funded by the registration fees paid by shippers and others involved in hazmat transportation. The bill would modify the fee structure, providing flexibility to nearly double the funding of emergency response training programs without disproportionately impacting small business. Second, ACC supports provisions to assist the development and use of onboard telematics systems for railcars. Telematics have the potential to provide better visibility into railcar locations and may help monitor railcar conditions while in transit. The bill's grant funding and pilot programs can help enhance safety benefits of these technologies. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. ACC is committed to working with policymakers and our transportation partners to find data-driven solutions so the products of our industry can be delivered safely and without incident. I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sloan. Mr. Aruca, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Nels, Ranking Members Wilson and Larson, members of the committee, and thank you for the invitation to be here. My name is David Aroka, National Legislative Director for the Transportation Communications Union. I'm here to testify about the imminent and immense need for legislation that improves the safety of our nation's rail network. I'd like to briefly pay my respects to the subcommittee's former chairman, Donald Payne. He was indeed one of the kindest souls on Capitol Hill, and he cared deeply for railroad workers. He will be missed dearly. I also want to extend our union's deepest sympathies to the residents of East Palestine, its surrounding communities, and especially the first responders. Please know that we want the same thing as you, to make sure this never happens again. TCU represents various crafts across the rail industry, but germane to this hearing are the carmen, those tasked with maintaining, repairing, and inspecting all freight rail cars for FRA reportable defects. We represent carmen in every Class 1 all across the country. What I'm about to tell you may seem shocking, but it's the truth. The railroads do not want to know how defective their trains are. Please know that we do not make this conclusion lightly, but it is based on years of watching how the railroads have systematically rigged their operations to avoid and evade quality safety inspections, including cutting the carmen's time to inspect by 2/3 or more, turning off defect detectors when the number of defects identified becomes too inconvenient, and relying upon inspections by untrained crews and utility personnel, not despite, but because they are held to a lower regulatory standard. To quote a recent investigative piece from ProPublica, the railroads use performance pay systems that effectively penalize supervisors for taking the time to fix hazards, and that pressure them to quash dissent, threatening and firing the very workers they hired to keep their operations safe. As a result, trains with known problems are rolling from yard to yard like ticking time bombs, getting passed down the line for the next crew to defuse or defer again, unquote. Just recently, the FRA had to halt their safety culture study at Union Pacific, citing that employees were coached in their responses, or that employees were reluctant to even participate, citing intimidation or fear of retaliation. Just last week, the FRA completed a qualitative time study of mechanical inspections across all the Class 1s, which is attached to my testimony. Their findings would be eye-opening to non-railroaders. When FRA is present, carmen are given on average a mere 1 minute and 38 seconds per car to inspect. Still too short. But when the FRA isn't there, that time drops even further to 44 seconds per car or 22 seconds per side. When addressing train crews or utility personnel performing these inspections, quote, report data and time observations do not support confidence in the performance of quality inspections, and that mechanical employees perform a more quality brake test when given adequate time, and this would contribute to a safer train, unquote. Safer trains means fewer defects, fewer injuries, and therefore fewer East Palestinians. Sadly, the prevailing mindset of the Class 1s in the current so-called precision-scheduled railroading era can be summed up in a common refrain that our members hear every single day from their managers. We're in the business of moving freight, not fixing rail cars. In June 2022, TCU Carmen Division President Don Grissom testified to this very committee about many of these pressures, but nothing has been done. Fatigue issues remain abound in the industry as forced overtime of 16 and even 24-hour shifts now force many carmen to sleep in their cars because they're too tired to drive. I asked members of the committee, if it's too dangerous for you to drive, isn't it too dangerous to work in a rail yard? The FRA under Administrator Bose has been trying to help combat these safety issues, but we believe the agency is under-resourced and their field inspectors lack the teeth to enforce proper compliance. All of the aforementioned reasons is why our union is wholeheartedly endorsing the legislation introduced by Chairman Nels and Congressman Moulton, just as we support Brown-Vance. We're specifically grateful to Chairman Nels, Senator Vance, and all the Republican co-sponsors for having the courage to step away from party orthodoxy that has historically drawn a partisan line between the railroads and rail labor. And obviously, I want to thank our Democratic friends, including Congressman DeLuzio, who has been so focused on this issue, for being long-standing supporters of rail safety efforts and rail workers. Indeed, it seems that both sides of the aisle can agree. Rail safety should never be a partisan issue. After all, every American agrees that trains need to stay on the tracks. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Roca. Mr. Hines, good to see you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman. Excuse me. Good afternoon, Chairman Nels, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to testify today. My name is Greg Hines. I am the National Legislative Director for the Transportation Division of Sheet Metal, Air, Rail, and Transportation. SMART TD is the largest labor organization in American railroading. We're extremely thankful to Chairman Nels and Congressman Moulton, as well as the current co-sponsors, for their leadership and willingness to prioritize safety in the railroad industry. And personally, Chairman Nels, I would like to thank you for being an honest broker throughout this process. I appreciate it. The disaster in East Palestine, Ohio, on February 3rd, 2023, served as a wake-up call to the nation. But for the men and women in the ranks of America's railroad workers, it was no surprise. The unfortunate reality is that in the accident's wake, little has changed. 3 major rail-related accidents have warranted investigations by the NTSB in the last month. One was a derailment resulting in a hazardous material leak in North Dakota. Another was a fatal accident involving a young conductor with less than 6 months' experience in Chicago. The most recent, last Friday, was a life-altering injury resulting in the double amputation of a conductor's limbs in Norfolk, Virginia. These are just 3 of dozens of rail accidents in the last 30 days. During the investigation of East Palestine, the role of the DOT 111 tank car was mentioned often. Last week in Oklahoma, a major derailment again exposed the frailty of that car. Like an aluminum can, the DOT 111 succumbed to the laws of physics when poorly built trains derailed, causing its contents to spill. Like most derailments involving mixed manifest trains, the trains are excessively lengthy and with great weight, and the haphazard makeup resulted in damage and a hazmat breach. Longer, heavier trains are more difficult to stop. The heavier a train is, the more inertia it possesses. The more weight on the rear, the more forces come crashing in on the cars during a derailment. Greater momentum causes greater destruction. It's basic physics. No meaningful technology, including distributed power units, locomotives, railroads throw in the middle of run longer trains, changes that. This legislation and ensuring proper inspections are being performed so that unsafe equipment is removed from the rails can make things safer. Carriers have cut crafts to forces less employees to perform safety inspection to cut cost. This results in faulty and unsafe equipment getting into the system. With defect detectors not being used to the full capacity and short staffing, you have a recipe for disaster. Meaningful data is needed. One solution is the confidential close call reporting system, or as we refer to it, C3RS. Programs such as this have been wildly successful in other modes of transportation. Look no further than the Aviation Safety Action Program. Today, just 28 of hundreds of U.S. railroad properties use this program to objectively identify where safety can improve. 2 of the largest, Norfolk Southern and BNSF, have taken steps. But on a limited scope, C3RS should be the rule rather than the exception. This bill does that. Lastly, ever present is the effort by the railroads to reduce two-person crews to just one on a freight train. Every single day, lives are saved and accidents prevented because of those two people aboard a freight train. Data does not exist that a reduction in crew size would improve rail safety whatsoever. I ask you, would you rather have two people or one person running a train that weighs thousands of tons if something goes wrong? In East Palestine, the engineer, the conductor, and the trainee took action. The coordinated efforts of the crew have been well documented and largely credited by NS and FRA and the rail labor community in mitigating the damage that night. If the big railroads are given their way and two certified railroad professionals aren't in the locomotive during their next major rail disaster, do we really want to see the difference having a conductor truly makes? The DOT recently finalized a regulation mandating two-person crews for freight trains, and we are grateful. But railroads still seek to subvert this common sense regulation with legal challenges. Congress must follow Chairman Nell's lead and pass the Railroad Safety Enhancement Act of 2024 to codify this life-saving necessity into law. America's railroads are the greatest in the world. The process and protocols governing them are not. Major derailments and hazardous material releases have become common. America's railroad workers and the communities they traverse deserve better. Smart TD urges Congress to act on rail safety and pass the Railroad Safety Enhancement Act of 2024. Thanks for the opportunity to testify, and we look forward to answering questions of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Hines. I thank you all for your testimony. We will now turn to questions from the panel. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. I will start by asking in unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record. A letter from the Association of American Railroads to Secretary Buttigieg on March 2nd of 2023, an article entitled Freight Railroads Announce Key Safety Measures in Drive to Zero Accidents, dated March 8th, 2023. Without objection, so ordered. In response to East Palestine, the Association of American Railroads, which represents the Class I railroads, announced 7 steps to reach zero incidents and zero injuries. You can find it on their website. I have the document. It's right here. The first step, AAR listed, was detector spacing. AAR stated the industry would deploy 1,000 new hotbox detectors and set a goal of achieving a 15-mile average between detectors. Ms. Hamidi, would this average spacing have made a difference in East Palestine?
It would not have.
All right. The fourth safety measure AAR announced was that all Class 1s are joining the FRA's voluntary confidential close call reporting system. This is it. This is the letter. They sent the letter dated March 2nd, 2023 to Secretary Buttigieg. Mr. Bowles, how many Class 1s are enrolled in the program, and how many employees of those railroads are covered by the program?
Mr. Chairman, 2 railroads have pilot programs, approximately 1,500 craft workers from conductors, engineers, and dispatchers.
The letter is well over a year old, March of 2023, and you got 2 of the 6. Chairwoman Hamidi, I would like to thank you and your team on the hard work and thorough final report. You did a great job. There have been some allegations about Norfolk Southern's conduct that I would like to have addressed. I want to address it for the record. In your opinion, was Norfolk Southern open, honest, and transparent with your investigation?
They were open, they were honest, and they were transparent based on our requests for information. Was it timely? No. Were other actions taken that were in violation of our party regulations and our party rules? Yes.
Mr. Hines, One of the most contentious provisions of the RSA you alluded to in your opening in our legislation is the crew size mandate. Please explain why Congress should mandate this provision and how it contributes to safety.
Well, thank you. That's a great question. Keeping the duties of a conductor are different than the duties of an engineer. And the engineer primarily operates the train. The conductor does anything that takes place off of the locomotives and things that take place in the cab. They have different jobs. And I think it's important to point out that as far as grade crossing accidents go, which we have thousands of every year, it's the conductor who gets off the train when either a derailment happens or if a car is hit in a grade crossing. The conductor goes back, assesses the situation, relays that information to the engineer, and the engineer gets emergency services underway and out there. And depending on where they're coming from, you may have to make a separation in the train to allow emergency through.
Yeah.
And you could never do that with just one person.
Yeah, I would like to add that this new legislation proposed in the House and Senate still preserves a waiver to the FRA for the purposes regarding crew size. Mr. Sloan, I think it's important to have a shipper here to discuss rail safety and how it impacts them. For too long, you've been excluded. You haven't really been part of this. In terms of rail safety, what concerns do shippers have, and is there anything we're missing?
Thank you for the question. We have supported the bill because I think, like I say, it provides a solid foundation to move forward. So I think it has largely addressed the concerns that we have raised with the committee and on the Senate side.
Sure. Mr. Aroka, as mentioned in your testimony, we all seem to agree that the railroad should be profitable. Got to be profitable, but they got to be safe. They got to be safe. How would the proposed legislation improve safety but not restrict the railroad's ability to operate on time?
Well, first and foremost, Mr. Chair, I do want to make note that nobody has a greater interest in the success of the railroads than the people that work for them. If the railroads don't make money, we can't argue for better contracts, wages, benefits, working conditions, all that goes out the window. Secondarily, the service critics that might be critical of this bill, they're just simply wrong. I mean, I'm sitting next to one of the largest rail customers in the country. I don't think he would be supporting the legislation if he thought it was going to completely destroy rail service for his entire industry. At the end of the day, for the carmen, you have two options. You either give the carmen enough time to do their job and inspect all these trains, or you assign more carmen to inspect the trains. The answer is not what's currently going on, which is just to not properly inspect them at all. That's what I would say.
Thank you. I'll yield the balance. I will now recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Aroka, there are two types of federal train inspections. An inspection by a qualified carman who inspects 195 points on each car, and the locomotive crew inspection that covers only 12 points. What are some of the things that the shorter inspection does not cover?
Thank you, Ranking Member. Well, I brought a little bit of a visual indication here. So this is I printed out the portions of the FRA's MP&E, or Motive, Power, and Equipment Compliance Manual, that the inspectors are required to use and that our members are required to inspect to. This is what the carmen are having to inspect to. This is, as you can see, quite a stack of paper. It cites parts 215, 231, and 232. These 2 pages is what a crew member is required to inspect to. 12 points of inspection, they're generalized, versus a carman has 180 different specific components where you actually have to measure for tolerances on various parts of those components. You have gauges and tools. Unfortunately, and this is not to detract from our brothers and sisters in the operating crafts, but they don't have the time to do this. They have other tasks to do. They have to get their freight ready to roll. The carmen are supposed to be the ones to make sure everything's safe. It's important to have the carmen there making sure everything is safe.
So you feel that employees are feeling pressured to rush inspections to keep the trains on schedule?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that the FRA's recent time study just showcased is, how the Carmen today, even a minute 30 that some people have been floating around, or that when FRA is present, that's what they're observed, that's not how the Carmen are actually treated as soon as the FRA walks out of the yard. It's down to 22 seconds aside. You cannot inspect, you can barely physically walk the length of a train car in 22 seconds, let alone pay any attention to any amount of detail on the car.
There's a Wall Street Journal article that actually says that Norfolk Southern's rail yard workers were expected to inspect each rail car in 1 minute so that the trains could leave on schedule. Do you think 1 minute is sufficient to perform all the needed safety checks on one rail car? I think you kind of answered that.
Yeah, well, that's the funny thing, is that policy was in place, but it's not even 1 minute. I remember Norfolk Southern's response was like, well, that's a bit of a guideline. Well, the FRA's study that just came out last week showed they're not even giving them a minute, but 44 seconds. So 22 seconds aside. And this is a year and a half after East Palestine, where a lot of media has covered this issue because our carmen are sick and tired of it. They're rushed, they can't do the job well.
Thank you. Mr. Hines, your testimony was riveting when you talked about all the accidents that have happened since. I'm stunned. How has the implementation of precision schedule railroading impacted safety, in your estimation?
Thank you for the question. That's been the death knell for the railroads as far as long-term safety for the railroad industry. Things that when I started working for the railroad over 30 years ago, they're doing things now that I never even imagined that they would try. We would be fired if we tried to cut the corners the way they cut corners now. It's the modeling, the short-term modeling of operation ratios and lowering the operation ratio. And that just becomes all they care about. And Wall Street tells them, you've got to cut crews. You've got to cut your labor. You've got to cut. And it's by doing PSR, it's made them incredibly profitable, more profitable than ever in the history of the world, but less safe. And I mean, the catastrophes that we're seeing happen now are happening far too frequently.
Thank you. Chair Hominy, was Oxyvinyls informed that a vent and burn was going to happen before it took place?
A vent and burn was discussed Sunday night, yes. There were several discussions between the Norfolk Southern's contractors and Oxyvinyls.
So do we know what the response was when they were told of this decision?
According to the interviews, Oxyvinyls stated that they did not believe a polymerization or a catastrophic chemical reaction was occurring in the tank cars, and they did not believe a vent and burn was necessary.
I'm out of time. I yield back.
Gentlelady
Thank you.
yields. I now recognize Mr. Babin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very, very much. Like many of you here today, I was shocked watching the East Palestine events unfold. And I think the American people want solutions to make sure that an event like this can never, ever happen again. The event was a tragedy, and I find it despicable that this catastrophe was not taken seriously by the White House. It took President Biden more than a year to go visit East Palestine. That slow response made Americans question the competency of the federal government and its capability of responding to disasters like this. The optics of small-town America being devastated without getting personal attention from our nation's highest office did not build any confidence in this administration. Fortunately, President Trump and his vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, made it very clear that this was going to be a top priority for them moving forward. And now that we've got an NTSB report in hand, I think that we need to focus on concrete ways to improve rail safety, improve the transportation of chemical goods, and rebuild American confidence in our transportation sector. So let's use today as a great chance to move forwards on the same page. My first couple of questions are for Mr. Jeff Sloan with the American Chemistry Council. No doubt, following the events in East Palestine, many Americans realized for the first time that our rail and chemical industry work very closely together. Mr. Sloan, would you give a very brief overview of the role that chemical companies play in ensuring the safe transportation of chemicals by rail? And after that, do you believe rail is a safe way to move hazardous chemicals, or is there a better way to move them?
Yeah, I'll start with the
Okay.
second question first. Rail is the safest way to move hazardous materials by land, and our industry is reliant on the rail industry to deliver our products where they're needed across the country. I think we have a collaborative relationship with the railroads when it comes to safety, and I think a prime example of this would be the TransCare program, which ACC cooperates with the Class 1 railroads to provide hands-on training to local emergency responders. We do this with support from, with grant funding support from PHMSA. And so we think this is an excellent example of how shippers, railroads, emergency responders, and government officials can work together.
Okay, thank you very much. Chairwoman Hollandy, I want to say thank you for all your hard work. This is several times that I've seen you in just the last month or so, coming up here talking about various transportation issues. And your good job doing a thorough NTSB report. Your efforts are truly appreciated. My next question is for you. The NTSB report on East Palestine goes into great detail identifying and explaining safety issues, as well as providing recommendations to industry, state, local, and federal entities. I understand a number of the recommendations from NTSB were meant to be handled at other levels of government or by the industry themselves. But can you share a few specific recommendations on what you believe that Congress can do to ensure that this tragedy never happens again? Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. One particular example would be an aggressive phase-out of DOT 111 tank cars. This started with the DOT 111 tank car in flammable service, but then also expanding that to include other hazardous materials and phasing out those DOT 111s. That would be a tremendous improvement in rail safety overall. This has been something that we have recommended over 17 accidents going back to 2013. In fact, we had a study in 1991 and have been recommending it ever since. Here's what I'll say. I know there's a lot of discussion about whether to do a rail safety or rail safety improvements right now. This committee has a role, a critical role in improving rail safety, and you all have done so much on a bipartisan basis over decades. I worked for this committee for 14 years. I saw tremendous success on safety, everything from the Motor Carrier Safety Act in 1999, Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008, numerous highway and transit bills, pipeline reauthorization bills. You have done so much to improve safety. Now is the time, because this could occur in Texas, California, Wisconsin, Georgia. Well, it did occur in Pennsylvania because you were right on the border. It could occur anywhere. This is an opportunity to improve rail safety, and I hope you'll use it.
Thank you, and I will yield back.
I don't want to say that sounds like an endorsement of our bill, but hey, listen, I now recognize the co-author of the Railroad Safety Enhancement Act, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for your opening remarks describing this bill. I want to associate myself with those remarks, and I'm very proud of the piece of legislation that we've put together in cooperation with so many of the people here, so many of the folks represented here today, including the Class 1s. At the same time, I want to be careful to disassociate myself with some of our new colleagues' remarks at the beginning of this hearing, because unlike his partisan attack on the administration, this bill is truly bipartisan. And my colleague, Chairman Nels, has been a wonderful partner. Unlike his vitriol against railroads, Mr. Sloan and others have reminded us that rail is the safest way to transport hazardous materials across the country. And so the point of this bill is not to wreck the railroads, but to improve their safety and competitiveness. We want the railroads to be safer and more competitive and to take more trucks off the highways. In 2023, there were 22,543 hazardous materials incidents on our nation's highways, compared to 297 freight rail hazmat incidents. If that's not compelling, 22,543 on highways versus 297 on freight rail, I'm not sure what is. But having said that, we want to see 297 go to zero. From 2012 to 2023, there have been 0 railway deaths with hazardous materials, while there have been 82 fatalities on highways with hazmat. So railroads are already doing pretty well, but we want them to do better. And ultimately, we share the goal of shifting more traffic from unsafe highways to safe railroads. That's a large part of the goal of this bill. Now, Mr. Bose, after the East Palestine derailment, Norfolk Southern was attacked by an investment fund named Ancora Holdings, trying to take over the company, citing the tragedy at East Palestine as a reason for change. Yet their primary line of attack was that the railroad could make better returns by implementing precision scheduled railroading. This Ohio-based family wealth fund wants a railroad of longer trains manned by fewer personnel and less reinvestment in infrastructure to return more short-term money annually to shareholders. Based on the data we have today, Mr. Bose, would longer trains, fewer personnel for operations and maintenance, and less reinvestment in infrastructure improve railroad safety?
Congressman, thank you for the question. No.
No, it would not. Well, in response to Ancora's attacks, Norfolk Southern CEO Alan Shaw changed out his chief operating officer for someone more steeped in precision scheduled railroading and brought 3 Ancora directors onto the board. That's the effect of this family wealth fund based in Ohio, the same state where East Palestine occurred. This is going to make things worse. And so the point is that railroads are safe today. We want to make them safer, but there's work to do, because even if you just look at how Norfolk Southern has handled things over the last 2 years, it seems like they're moving in the opposite direction. Now, Chair Hamady, I was taken aback by the video you obtained, which showed that the bearing that caused the East Palestine tragedy was on fire for miles before the train derailed. And when it passed hot boxes, it was reading 103 degrees at 115 degrees. This did not trigger an alert. Now, this little ring on my finger measures my body temperature all day long. It costs a couple $100, in addition to taking much more complex measurements of my heart rate, variability, et cetera. If every wheel on a freight train had a temperature sensor like that transmitted directly to the locomotive engineer to detect any unexplained rise in temperature, would that make trains safer?
Yes, it would make trains safer.
Mr. Bose, would this technology providing constant real-time measurements directly to operating crews be more effective than simply having more wayside detectors?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Sloan, would your customers benefit from having real-time location and car health data on their shipments and on the cars hauling them across the country?
I mean, we believe that onboard sensors have the potential to provide additional safety benefits, but I think there's a lot of work still to develop them and make
Yeah, but I'm not asking you about that. I asked them about safety. I'm asking, would it benefit your customers to know where their cars are and whether they're healthy?
Yes.
Yes, right. Mr. Aruka, would your members benefit from knowing real-time data on the health and safety of their rail cars so that they can make appropriate repairs when they get to terminals?
Absolutely.
And Mr. Hines, would this data make our trains safer across America?
Yes.
This is the kind of innovation included in this bill. This is innovation that will make railroads safer, that will move this industry forward, that will make them more competitive. And that's why this bill is so bipartisan, and it's why we ought to get support, not just from all the groups represented up here, but from the Class 1s as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Moulton. It's an honor to work with you. I now recognize Mr. Lamalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To our panelists there, how practical is it, I'll start with Ms. Hamidi, to every rail car has approximately 8 wheels that would be monitored under what Mr. Moulton was just talking about with a data point on that. So a 100-car train, you'd have 800 pieces of data coming at the engineer. Is that practical for an engineer to be monitoring that much data and still operate a train?
The data would probably go to the back office. It would not go to the engineer.
All right. So is that manageable at that kind of distance with that many, with the amount of trains that are running across the country? Or is there something a little more halfway in between of what we have now with a railroad side heat temperature monitor versus a device on every single bearing on all the rail cars?
Hot bearing detectors are effective, but we need more advanced technology to ensure greater safety. That would include acoustic bearing detectors and onboard sensors.
Last time we were here, I had some follow-up questions afterwards with you on that where, a bearing is indicating 103 degrees, 115, burning up obviously isn't accurate information. So were you able to just find anything more additional on that, particularly with the Palestine one?
Yeah, for this one, it was, so that bearing registered at 38 degrees at milepost 79.8. We know that it was registering at 103 degrees at just 10 miles later in Salem, Ohio, but we also know from video that it was on fire. So 103 degrees doesn't make sense, as you mentioned. And that's because it can take 30 to 60 minutes for the internal defect to result in the actual temperature, which could have been 253 at milepost 49, but that was the highest that would have sensed at that time.
Okay, thank you. Let me shift to coming back to the incident. There was the vast number of agencies that were part of the response. My figures is 48 different agencies were involved one way or the other at the time of or follow-up on that. How do you see we can have a better job of coordinating, maybe don't have so many to deal with in a short amount of time to make a key decision? I'm still bothered by the decision to burn the material in the rail car.
Are you referring to the vent and burn, or are you referring to the emergency response immediately after the derailment?
Immediately after.
So immediately after the derailment, emergency responders need information. They need to know what's in those train cars to protect themselves, and they need to know what's in there to protect communities. And that's by getting the train consist from the railroads. By law, it's their requirement to provide that information to emergency responders. It is not unknown to a railroad what their network is, where their trains operate. They know when a derailment occurs. We have email. Send a train consist to an incident commander. In this case, it would have been the East Palestine Fire Department. They were incident command. But the incident commanders did not have access to that train consist for hours. Meanwhile, they were getting exposed to a significant hazardous materials release. I'll also mention radio interoperability was a big issue. These agencies could not talk to each other, and that can happen anywhere, and something that I hope you'll address even in this bill.
How do we improve this coordination?
I'm sorry?
How can we improve this coordination amongst information on what's on the rail cars and immediacy for those emergency folks?
I don't think Ask Rail is the answer. I don't, because there are so many communities across the United States that you may not have internet service or be able to access anything on your phone or even know to access something on your phone. This is information. Again, the railroads know what's moving on their network. They know who is on their network. They can provide that information. We email all day long. They know when a derailment occurs, provide the information in a timely way to 911. It's not hard for them to do that, and they should be held accountable for doing that.
Well, they know this before the train leaves a yard, let alone having to worry about whether there's internet connection or not on site. What does it look like to have that information relayed before the train even leaves its original point in picking up that chemical?
They have the list. They have it both in electronic form and in paper form.
So why could that not be relayed all the way down the line, I guess?
It can, certainly when they know there is a derailment, they'll provide that.
Well, even without a derailment, we should know, hey, this is going to be coming through this town at this approximate time. Why would that be tough?
They could. You might have an overload of information to emergency response agencies, and when there isn't a derailment that occurs. But when there is one, and here's where I'll say, PHMSA just issued a final rule that requires that information to be provided immediately. So perhaps the deputy administrator would like to talk about their final rule.
Well, the chairman might get after me on time here. It's up to him.
We'll come back for a second round if you want to hang out.
Thank you, sir.
I now recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair and Ranking Member, and to all of our witnesses this afternoon. With over 7,400 miles of railroad tracks in Chicagoland and many running through my district, the safety, the public, and rail workers is a paramount matter for me. And while rail is a fundamental pillar of Chicago, it also presents risks to communities. A couple of weeks ago, we lost a Union Pacific Rail employee named Justin Pender in a tragic accident at a rail yard in my district. Justin was only 27 years old and was riding a tank car when he was crushed by a passing car or train. My thoughts are with his family and friends in the wake of this tragedy. Simply put, we must do better for our rail workers. While we have been awaiting the NTSB East Palestine report, the findings tell us what we already know. There is a systemic culture of putting profits over the safety of workers and the public. Mr. Aroka, your testimony points to a dramatic decline in the number of rail inspections, pressures to reduce inspection times, and managers being docked or evaluations based on how many cars they tag for repairs. Can you explain how these factors contribute to the culture that puts those profits over safety of workers and the public?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, there's largely a sentiment, and as the ProPublica article in my testimony mentioned, but also as noted in the FRA's recent letter, there's a notable culture of harassment for managers. You are tasked with getting something out the door as quick as possible. If the number of defects starts rising above a certain threshold, whether that's found during inspections or by actual detectors, there is a level where management says, no more, we're done, no more defects. Well, that's not safe. You can't not find defects anymore. That doesn't make them poof, go away. They're still there. So we have to do something to alter the processes, alter the ways in which carmen are allowed to actually go out there and inspect things, and make sure the trains are actually adequately checked before they head out the door. But in a broader perspective, the PSR business model is all about reducing dwell time at all costs. It means, all types of things are going to be shortened, whether it's your inspections, whether it's lacing up hoses, all of the number of actions, and I hope my friend Mr. Hines will pipe in on this, that his members are harassed to shorten their timeframes as well. None of that is safe. We believe these processes need to be addressed.
Thank you. Chair Hummendy, although the wheel bearing that failed on the East Palestine train was indicated in an alert, it was low priority alert and did not reflect the true condition of the bearing. In addition to this, NTSB indicated that railroads' operational responses to bearing alerts is an issue in itself. Is there a way to improve the accuracy of these alerts? And in your opinion, are rail workers empowered to respond to alerts in a way that minimizes risk?
Well, in this case, there was only one person working that desk at the time. Norfolk Southern had additional personnel. They went down to one. Now they've added more personnel. So having more personnel certainly could help. With respect to our findings and our recommendations, our biggest recommendation is to the Federal Railroad Administration to do research on bearings, including railroad responses to alerts and thresholds and spacing, and then to develop regulations around that.
And are rail workers empowered to report these things?
Our rail workers, well, we're currently doing a safety culture assessment of Norfolk Southern, and that's one of the questions that we have. That we've done a survey of all of Norfolk Southern's employees, and we're looking at the responses now, and one of the questions we have is, are you empowered? Do you feel empowered to report unsafe conditions? And we're going to have to evaluate that. So it's not a question I could answer right now, but we'll return back to you.
We'll be looking forward. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Williams for 5 minutes.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't touch my microphone again. And thank you all for your very detailed answers and response. I'm really trying to swim in the middle of all of these, facts and details, frankly, in the lens of looking at my own community. So we're fortunate to have a significant investment by CSX in my district, but that, of course, also brings the traffic and the rail lines with it. And so the findings of this committee and your testimony are very important in Syracuse, New York, and Central New York. And so that's really the context that I'm trying to understand this. It just touches a lot of families in my area. I understand that accidents happen, and could each of you that can answer this, what's the likelihood of a similar East Palestine type accident, chemical car derailment, fire, happening in my district, in the lines in my community?
Congressman, it's hard to answer that exactly. I will say this. Fortunately, unfortunately, we've learned a lot from East Palestine. I think the railroad industry has learned a lot not to repeat, again, the things that did or did not happen there.
Anyone else? I would appreciate just any other context. And that's, by the way, very helpful, Mr. Bose.
I appreciate that, except the NTSB has investigated numerous rail accidents over decades where we've issued recommendations that we've repeated and repeated and repeated with zero action by the railroads, by some regulators. And so, yes, I can't quantify a likelihood for a number, but could it occur in your district? It could occur in any of your districts. And we will be there. But again, we'll probably have additional recommendations that we have issued previously.
As a follow-up to that, are there any recommendations coming out of this particular accident that have been implemented widely and that should give my community more confidence in the rail? Based on the recommendations, I understand that perhaps over decades, many haven't, but in this case, it sounds like there's been a lot of recommendations that have been implemented. Can you comment on those?
The deputy administrator might want to now take the time to talk about the final rule.
Well, the Congressman from California's earlier comments about providing information to first responders in the event of an incident, that is something that Congress directed us to do, but in talking to the firefighters and first responders, and to echo the chairwoman's comments earlier, they didn't have access to the train consist until after they arrived on scene, well after they arrived on scene. And so what we are requiring is that the railroads that have that information at all times get it to the 911 call centers, get it to your first responders so they have that information and are able to respond. The other thing that Congress has been paid attention to, and multiple bills that this committee has introduced, to phase out the DOT 111s, which the NTSB chair also emphasized is critically at issue and can significantly reduce the likelihood of a major incident occurring in your district. And so phasing that out, that's something that our agency proposed requiring more than 10 years ago, but requires Congress taking action.
If I could just add, we issued 34 new safety recommendations as a result of this investigation. None of them have been implemented. Several of them have been reiterated, and we have requested over decades to be addressed.
Congressman, FRA is going to take those recommendations that NTSB has put forward, and we will accept those recommendations and have already started action on that. One area where congressional legislation will be extremely helpful, and bills like the one the chairman and Congressman Moulton introduced and the ranking member, is an increase in fines for violations of rail safety regulations.
You know, often Congress may be a bit of an accusatory body, but occasionally we're a deliberative body. And so your comments are well received and timely and appreciated. So thank you.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. DeLuzio, who is an original co-sponsor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for calling this hearing and for the good collaboration and work on this legislation, which, as I hope folks can see, is quite bipartisan, is bicameral. We ought to get it passed. This should not be a partisan fight. This should not be one that we cannot come together to pass. I was very encouraged to hear from my counterpart across the border in Ohio, Mr. Rulli, who represents the people of East Palestine. Of course, I represent the folks on the Pennsylvania side impacted by that derailment. And I hope for the American people who have been watching, they understand that the federal representatives who represent those communities, who could be any of our communities, are in the fight for rail safety for as long as it takes. What I have said all along, and I know I'm not alone, is that I refuse to let my constituents be treated like collateral damage in the way of railroad profits. And the common sense measures that we are debating today, I think will go a long way toward making sure that they are never treated that way ever again. The risks in my district are not hypothetical, and they're not hypothetical, I think, for many others. I commissioned a congressional research report about my district. 95% of my constituents live within 5 miles of the tracks. Nearly half live within a mile. This could happen elsewhere in my district. It could happen in plenty of other parts of the country as well. Now, it's been nearly a year and a half since this derailment. And one of the lines that I and others have been told for a long time was that the railroads could take care of this themselves. They would operate more safely. Let's look at the data. According to FRA data earlier this year, in 2023, now the derailment happened the first part of 2023, we saw derailments increase 13.5%. I introduced the Railway Safety Act last March. It's one of those bills, I think maybe the only, that both former President Trump and President Biden have supported. It's got bipartisan support. We're now building from it on this legislation. We've got new momentum, finally, to get legislation passed. Chair Hamady, in the final NTSB report, you recommended establishing regulations on bearing defect detection systems. That's in the Railroad Safety Enhancement Act, is it not?
Yes.
You recommended improving local preparedness for hazardous materials being transported through communities like mine. That happens when trains are properly designated as high hazard. That's in our legislation, isn't it?
Yes, I might have some technical request on that to further improve it, but
Good.
Great job.
And that's the hope for us to have a markup where we can make some of those changes. We do it. Thank you. Mr. Aruca, you discussed, and Mr. Hines as well, industry average time for qualified mechanical inspectors to perform their inspections is not enough time. We need to make sure workers have sufficient time to perform proper safety inspections. That's in our legislation. Mr. Hines, you talked about advocating for two-person crew minimums and what can happen if there were to be one person on those trains. That's in our legislation. My point is, we got to pass the darn bill. There are provisions in here that will keep folks safer, that will make rail safer, that would give us the ability to not just protect communities, but move things more safely on the rails. My constituents saw a toxic fireball fly over their houses after this derailment, one that shouldn't have happened. My constituents, our neighbors in Ohio, are worried about the health of their families, worried about their drinking water, the air they breathe, the land they grow the crops on, and Congress has yet to pass rail safety legislation. We are finally seeing momentum. I'll ask a very simple question down the line. It's one I asked Secretary Buttigieg when he was here as well. Chair Hamady, do you trust the big railroads to regulate themselves?
I do not.
No. Nope.
I'm not sure I'm going to qualify to answer that.
Fair enough. Ruka?
Can I use a curse word to say no? No, absolutely not.
I'm not sure I heard the question right
Do you
because I
trust
can't hear because I'm a railroader.
Mr. Hines, do you trust the railroads to regulate themselves?
Do I what?
Do you trust the railroads to regulate themselves?
Absolutely not. We have a 150-year record to look at.
I think I agree. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Fang for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a quick question, and this is certainly an important hearing as we learn the lessons of what happened and with this derailment. To the Federal Rail Administrator, I represent the city of Tehachapi, which is in the mountains of California. And in recent years, there have been multiple derailments in the area. And I've heard that local authorities in my community have not received notification about these derailments in a timely manner. To improve communication between local authorities and the railroads, what is being done to let the local authorities know about local derailments when they occur? And what is the standard practice when derailments do occur in notification?
Congressman, in terms of notification on a derailment, the railroad company is responsible for communicating that to the National Response Center. And depending on the level of the derailment, FRA dispatches investigators to the site. Obviously, emergency responders, local folks are alerted to that. As we've talked about, depending on the type of material that is on the train, there is supposed to be advance notification of the type of material that is on the train so that emergency responders in the area, the state, has an idea of that.
So is it dependent on the material? So I do understand that with something that's highly flammable, they're required to notify the state's Emergency Response Commission. But in any other instances, is there like a certain turnaround time they have to do it in, or is it just up to the
I can just jump in here because last month we finalized new requirements that if the emergency responders are deployed to respond to a hazardous materials related derailment, then they are required to notify immediately via the 911 call centers. And they are also required to update the real-time Ask Rail electronically and communicate that information to the first responders. And they're required to keep paper copies as well so that first responders can access that.
And if it's non-hazardous materials, is there specific guidelines?
I gotta defer to others because we only deal with the hazardous materials.
It depends on the level of derailment.
Can you spell that out? What are the shades of derailment?
Well, it depends on the number of cars derailed. Derailments can happen of all types and nature. There can be multiple cars involved, so it depends on the number of cars involved. Again, it depends on the type of material on board. If there's a roadway involved, right, and a grade crossing involved, and then obviously if there are houses nearby and schools and hospitals. So again, it depends on the situation. But if it's a populated area, there should be automatic notification.
Okay. So to improve the notification, the local community should work with the railroad?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Ranking Member, for convening this essential hearing. And thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. The United States is renowned for having one of the most extensive rail networks in the world. However, this distinction comes with an equally immense responsibility to ensure the safety and efficiency of our rail system. Tragically, the recent incident in East Palestine stands as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of falling short of our obligations. This disaster wreaked havoc on the environment and placed countless lives at grave risk. While we have made some strides to elevate our safety measures through historic investments in the bipartisan infrastructure law, the number of rail incidents in 2023 surpassed those in 2022, showing that the issue is not improving. It's clear that much more work needs to be done to address the vulnerabilities in our railroads. We must take decisive action to guarantee a safe, reliable, and robust freight and passenger rail network for our communities that truly lives up to its extensive reputation. Mr. Aruka, in your testimony, you mentioned that the Transportation Communications Union Brotherhood of Railway Carmen Division represents approximately 10,000 carmen nationwide. These skilled workers conduct thorough inspections to ensure compliance with safety standards, but face time pressures that impact their ability to prioritize safety effectively. Can you please elaborate on some of the most critical safety components that are often neglected due to time pressures?
Sure, thank you, Congressman. One of the problems that you're looking for, the big key components, you're looking at the wheels, broken wheels, thin flanges, so that's the little part of the steel wheel that keeps the train on the track. You're obviously looking, as germane to this hearing, at bearings, which do have a visual indication when they are failing. There's flung grease all across the trucks and components. You're looking at the actual couplers, pins, all the safety appliances that make sure that Mr. Hines' members can safely operate the train. So when they're out there delivering freight, they don't fall off a ladder or a sill, or it can use a handbrake. So there are a whole number of components that the carmen are trained to inspect, but they don't have enough time to ever actually get to. Most of the time, or not most, but some of the times, the railroads are putting our guys on ATVs and having them drive along the side of a train. How much of a detailed inspection does that provide for? It's just insane.
How does the inability to perform full inspections specifically impact the safety and well-being of railroad workers?
Well, it's pretty dejecting when you're trained to do something. As our Carmen president, Grissom, likes to say, this is the only career that he's ever heard of where they hire you to do a job and then they fire you once you try to do it. It's a very strange thing. But that is detailed throughout a lot of the articles that have been written about the Carmen, and that's why I'm here today trying to get Congress to pass this legislation, improve the lives of my Carmen so they can keep the trains a little bit safer.
Congressman, if I could jump in there, in terms of inspections, qualified mechanical inspections are the gold standard of inspections. There are certain situations where other crafts, Mr. Hines, who's at the table, represents conductors. There are certain crafts that can do inspections, but they should be done on a limited basis in special circumstances. That should not be the norm in terms of inspections.
If I could actually follow up on that. We have been referring to as the loophole, the Appendix D loophole, is this part of the regulation, the pre-departure inspection, that allows for a conductor to be able to go and inspect a train, inspect a set of cars. But that's designed for when you're out in the network picking up freight. These regs were written, in the 80s. They've been maybe minorly updated here or there, but they were written when there were 33 Class 1s. There are now 6. In that era, when you had 33, you were getting inspections by carmen at every single interchange. Now we don't have that many interchanges anymore. So it's a whole different process, it's a whole different operation out there. We've got to improve inspections, and this legislation would do that.
Thank you. Now yield back.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Van Orden, who is also an original sponsor in this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like all the people on the panel who work for the Class 1 railroads to stand up, please. Let the record reflect that no one stood up because they didn't bother to show up, even though they're invited to this hearing. BNSF, Union Pacific, and Canadian National were all invited to this hearing, and they are not here, and that is shameful. That is not okay. I represent a little town called DeSoto, Wisconsin. We had record flooding last April. I called the BNSF Railroad on the 21st of April. I said, I'm distinctly uncomfortable with the conditions of the tracks due to the scouring that's taking place, due to the flooding of the Mississippi River, and the BNSF Railroad essentially patted me on the head on the phone and said, don't worry, Mr. Congressman, we've been doing this for 100 years, we know what the hell we're doing. And 6 days later, on the 27th, there were several rail cars full of paint and batteries floating down the Mississippi River that almost hit a lock and dam, which would have caused potentially a catastrophic cascading effect that could wipe out hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of wetland restoration. Needless to say, we don't have the best relationship at this point. Class 1 railroads have to understand one thing. They are not an entity unto their own. And they have gotten out of control. They are irresponsible. They are not receptive to any type of input that I've seen, and it's got to stop. I'm a retired Navy SEAL senior chief, and what that means is SEALs don't go anywhere without a swim buddy. And for them to tell you dudes that you're going to have one guy in a train, nope, that's a non-starter. So that is just foolish for them to argue that they're going to have one person on these trains. And I don't have a beef with the union guys. I'm a Republican. You need 2 people on those trains. That's unacceptable, and it's silly. I want to thank Mr. Bose and Ms. Hamidi for being so responsive when that happened. You guys are Johnny on the spot or Janie on the spot, and I appreciate that greatly. So, ma'am, I'm going to ask you, has anyone been fired, reassigned, counseled, or demoted due to the massive and preventable errors that took place in East Palestine?
Not that I am aware of, but I might not be aware.
Okay. Mr. Bose, you're FRA.
I'm not aware of any.
Has anyone quit in shame? Anybody? Anybody? I don't think so. All right. Ma'am, you have repeatedly stated that your agency has repeatedly given very specific safety recommendations to the railroads and that they are blowing you off. Is that correct?
We currently have 17 open rail safety recommendations to Norfolk Southern alone. We have 8 to all Class 1 railroads, and several of them have been open for many years. Overall, we have 215 open rail safety recommendations, many of which have been ignored.
Okay, so the railroads, by ignoring your safety recommendations, are putting these men's colleagues at risk, along with the vast majority of my constituents. So my grandkids, 4 of them, live about 3 blocks away from the railroad tracks in Prairie du Chien. And I want to be super clear, I love the railroads. And if you don't love the railroads, you don't live in Prairie, because we have trains going through all the time. And the only difference between East Palestine and what took place in DeSoto, which is right up the tracks, is they weren't hauling POL at the time. And so that would have been my grandkids' house, essentially. So we have to come to a place where these railroads understand that they must be responsive to your agencies. And do you have any type of recourse when they blow you off?
We do not. FRA has enforcement authority, however.
And what does that mean, sir?
Congressman, that means that when we find violations or non-compliance with our regulations, we issue fines, and we settle those fines. They have an ability to object, and we reach a settlement.
Would you, sir, do me a favor when this is over? Will you get me a list of those fines that you've levied?
Yes, sir. When we complete the process, we absolutely will.
Thank you. I would love to see.
The settlement, the fines, though, that you issue are settled. They can be settled for pennies on the dollar.
Right. So that's kind of what I'm getting at. I want to see the actual numbers that you submitted and what they actually paid, because we're not doing this anymore. The railroads need to be put in check, and that's what we're here to do. And I want to thank Chairman Nels for his leadership on this bill. Very happy to be an original co-sponsor and also the original for HR 4085, the Rail Inspector Safety Act, which came from a direct recommendation from you, ma'am. So keep up the good work. I appreciate it. I yield back.
But if I could say one thing to the Congressman.
It will be up to the chairman, sir. My time has expired.
Go ahead, sir. Answer his question if you want.
No, I just wanted to say thank you for bringing up the issue repeatedly now on the need for more FRA inspectors out in the field. We need more cops on the beat, and we need them to be more efficient. One of the things I mentioned in my testimony is the laborious nature of writing a violation for one single violation. If you look through the FRA's MP&E study, you'll see, for whatever was 1,400 defects found, 47 violations. Every single one of those defects is technically a violation. It just takes the inspector out of the field and into an office to write a mountain of paperwork and takes them away from where they're needed, out in the field. Why don't we have something that's like, for a police officer, writing a ticket, writing a parking ticket, writing a speeding ticket, to make the entire thing much more efficient and also give some teeth to the cops that need to be out there.
Right on.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Foshee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panelists here today. We appreciate you being here. The NTSB report found that 25% of the cars on the train that derailed in East Palestine contained defects, even though federal regulations require that a train's brakes must have no defects before it is allowed to depart. Unfortunately, a recent FRA study on freight rail car inspection times found that inspection times average a shockingly low 22 seconds per side for each rail car, that over 14% of the brakes are defective while the train is operating. Administrator Bowes, why are railroads allowed to operate trains that don't meet federal safety standards, and what consequences should railroads face for dispatching trains that don't meet safety standards?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. First of all, railroads are expected to have inspection, testing, and maintenance programs to ensure compliance with FRA regulations. FRA monitors for compliance with federal safety requirements, and we pursue enforcement action when necessary. And so we do issue civil penalties anytime we find non-compliance.
Mr. Aroka, I've been made aware that new digital inspection portals utilizing AI are being tested by a number of railroads and third parties. In your testimony, you acknowledge that this technology has the capacity to improve rail safety and increase the effectiveness of inspections if used properly. Where does your union stand on these technologies, and would they help minimize the risk of accidents like the one that occurred in East Palestine?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, as mentioned in my testimony, there are a number of technologies out there that exist that the railroads are either lightly deploying or testing or using improperly, such as these digital inspection portals. These are big camera rings. They have high-speed cameras that capture, hundreds, thousands of images per second, and then use machine vision and machine learning to actually try to identify defects. What we would like to see in the industry is that information be given directly to a carman in the yard as the train is coming in, so that they have, imagine an iPad on your wrist, and you're sitting there saying, I got defects in cars 1, 10, 28, et cetera. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening right now. The camera rings that are deployed are being used to discipline the carmen after the fact, so after the train departs. So in essence, what I'm trying to get across is they are simultaneously restricting down the time our carmen can actually inspect these cars, and then they're disciplining them on the back end using these fancy tools. Even the companies that built these things are telling the railroads, this is not how it's meant to be deployed. So we'd like to see some improvements there. Contrary to what some folks think, labor unions are not against technology. We just want we want it to be used correctly. So we want to have access to that defect detector network data, that type of data and imaging, but also the rest of the data that the defect detectors catch throughout the country. Lastly, I will say the mechanical desks at these railroads are very, very short-staffed. With the exception, I think, of the one that you visited, Chair Nels, in Homewood, I would say they're doing quite good. Everybody else has one guy looking at the entire network's defect detectors. One guy. Streams of emails coming in saying hotbox here, KIP reader impact there, or looking at this imaging. It's not a realistic concept to expect one individual at any one point to be looking at an entire nation, or at least an entire network of defect detectors.
So as you just touched on, this technology is currently unregulated. And
Yes.
Unfortunately, disasters like East Palestine are a result of allowing the railroads to self-regulate. There's currently no requirement for where this AI-enhanced technology should be deployed, or how it's used, or who should be interpreting the data. As this technology continues to develop and be implemented, what types of regulations or safeguards should there be put in place to ensure that the railroads are maximizing the effectiveness of this technology and thereby increasing rail safety outcomes? Just a follow-up on what you just
Sure.
gave to us.
Oh, thank you. So two things. One of the things that, and with all defect detectors, we don't believe you should be allowed to turn them off when they're inconvenient, first and foremost. Secondly, with regards to these fancy camera portals, we think that the imaging is best placed in the hands of the people that know what to do with it. So the qualified mechanical inspector, which is the regulatory term for a carman. These guys spend their entire lives looking at defects on rail cars. If they were able to have this brand new, amazing AI-driven technology placed directly in their hands, they'd be much more effective, efficient, and they'd make the entire network safer. But we have to have regulations or laws to make that so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
General Lady yields. I now recognize Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. East Palestine obviously was a tragedy, and in a wake of tragedies, so many of us feel a need to we've got to do something. And of course, all decisions have trade-offs. That's one of the rules of the universe, and all regulations impose costs on consumers. And so rather than just do something, obviously we want to move forward with prudence and with wisdom. We want to make sure that which we do actually improves life for society. And so I want to spend a little time thinking about what is the right path forward, Chair Homendy, for you. 34 recommendations on what I think most people think is a pretty good piece of work that you all did. Most of them don't deal with legislative action, of course. Some do. How would you prioritize? Which of the legislative approaches would you most highly prioritize?
For legislation?
Yes.
I would defer that to you all as the legislative body, but there are many recommendations that we have issued over a number of years. One in particular on DOT 111 tank cars, and I would say that there was an accident in Lesterville, South Dakota, involving DOT 111 tank cars in 2015. And here we have recommended doing something about it since 1991, and no action has been taken. So that's one. But we have additional areas we would recommend that action be taken.
So specifically among the 34 recommendations, I mean, related to legislative activity, which of those would you most highly prioritize?
An aggressive phase out of the DOT 111 tank cars is in there. An expansion of a phase out of DOT 111 tank cars in all hazardous materials service. Locomotive recorders, similar to action taken by this committee for the FAA bill for recorders. We would recommend that here since no action has been taken. And there are a number of areas.
So a couple of things that were not in the report is limiting train lengths and two-man crews, two-person crews. They were not included. Why?
The cause of this derailment was a failed bearing. It was a 9,300-foot train, and it wasn't a factor in the derailment.
Yeah, just were not directly involved in the tragedy.
Correct.
Yeah, gotcha. So Administrator Bose, turning to you, as the chair just mentioned, overheated bearings that created an axle separation. Have we seen railroads install wayside detectors since this tragedy?
They have been installing wayside detectors.
Do we have a sense of what kind of pace that installation moves at?
In Norfolk Southern's case, it sped up, and they've deployed more of them. In other railroads' cases, it's railroad by railroad, but the technology with detectors and the space between detectors, the distance between detectors, is something that the railroad companies are paying attention to. And Congressman, one more part of that, it's not just deploying, it's the training around that, the maintenance, the operation, and then when the information comes in, to have it properly resourced at the desk level, and then disseminating that information in a timely manner. And the thresholds are important on what set off alerts.
So one of the NTSB recommendations was for the FRA to further investigate bearing defect detection systems. Is it the FRA's intention to do so? And where are we at?
Congressman, yes, and we are.
Any additional detail you could provide?
We've been working on that through the Railroad Safety Advisory Committee, a committee that we reinvigorated under this administration, a body where consensus drives the day, and we're hopeful that there can be a productive product that comes out of that. There's a range of detectors, right? We're talking about hot bearing detectors.
I think we're trying to get at a timeline here. I mean, I understand the body, but I mean, are we looking at 3 months, 6 months, 10 months?
I can't commit to an exact time frame. We're moving expeditiously on it. Let me tell you something else, Congressman. You're talking about regulations. We've proposed 5 regulations in recent years. 4 of them are in litigation or have petitions for reconsideration. So when you talk about the industry, you talk about timing, you talk about regulations, you need to build in the opposition that we get from the industry when we try to do productive things.
Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Mr. Menendez, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses today for their testimonies, which provide an honest and sobering insight into the state of rail safety today in America. The derailment in East Palestine a year and a half ago forced thousands of residents to evacuate. Unfortunately, an event like that can happen at any time, anywhere. And I believe that's why so many of our colleagues from across the country care so deeply about how we move forward. Railroads operating high-hazard flammable trains, or HHFTs, are required to inform state emergency response officials of the frequency of HHFTs traveling through their states and develop spill response plans. However, the train that derailed in East Palestine did not fit the definition of an HHFT and instead was classified as a general merchandise train, meaning it was not subject to the same regulations as HHFTs. We know that general merchandise trains sometimes carry hazardous materials of various kinds, and we saw firsthand the kind of damage that they can cause. Chair Hamady, do general merchandise trains that carry hazardous materials pose a risk to people or the environment?
Yes.
Could expanding the scope of hazardous materials subject to increased safety regulations prevent future tragedies like the one in East Palestine?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Of course. Could expanding the scope of hazardous materials subject to increased safety regulations prevent future tragedies like the one in East Palestine?
Absolutely.
How can we ensure that state and local emergency response officials are informed and prepared to handle hazardous materials traveling through their states, even if that train is classified as a general merchandise train?
They need to be prepared. They need information on what's going through their communities, which we have recommendations on, and PHMSA has done some work on recently. They need gear, they need radio interoperability, and they need training.
And the training, I think, is probably one of the largest gating items because it depends on the community that you're involved in. It's ideally not something that you're dealing with frequently, if ever. So ensuring that as your members move through and retire and you have new members brought on board, they have to have access to that training to ensure that at any given moment they're prepared to handle that situation.
That's right.
Mr. Roca, your testimony goes into detail about the FRA's investigation into Class 1 safety inspection practices and how the FRA's findings align with alarms that your members have been sounding for years. In contrast, many Class 1s claim that safety is their #1 priority. Let's take them at their word. How can we ensure that if, in fact, safety is their #1 priority, that they stay committed to that, despite whether there's a change in administrations, whether time has faded the pain of what happened in East Palestine, which it never should? How can we work together to ensure that we are always creating the safest in-class experience for not just the operators, but the communities that they operate through?
Thank you, Congressman. That's a big question. Laws, first and foremost, statute. Passing this legislation would be a huge step in the right direction. Regulations can always be challenged, waived, amended. It's a little bit more cemented in permanence when you pass a law to say this is how it's got to be from now on. So first and foremost, I would say pass this bill. The Senate bill or Chair Nels's bill, you know, we have a lot of things that we can do in this industry to improve. In a large sense, the railroads need to be compelled to get there. As we all kind of, or most of us mentioned earlier, the railroads don't do things on their own accord. You have to drag them into the future. It's a weird industry practice, but it's long been that way. Whether it's defect detectors, new inspection systems, new technologies that are being tested and we see all the time, but somehow aren't really making it into the industry that could make things wildly safer. We need to get there, and we need legislation like this to help push the industry in the right direction, both for the benefit of my members who work them, but also every single community that our trains roll through. Because none of us want to see another East Palestine or a Lock-McGontick, God forbid. We need to have safety first mindset, and right now, in the PSR era, it's safety last.
Yeah, listen, I agree with you completely. And what I know about laws is that they can be made stronger and they can also be made weaker. And that's why I think it's important that we commit ourselves to an ideal of keeping our community safe, keeping your workers safe, and ensuring that safety is our #1 priority, not after a tragedy, but every single day, now and moving forward. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. I now recognize Mr. Yakim for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. Chair Hamady, I want to say publicly to you what I said privately during your recent briefing to us, and that is simply a thank you for your detailed and thorough investigation on the East Palestine incident.
Thank you.
I'm glad that we're having this hearing on the East Palestine derailment, but I want to commend the chairman in particular for holding this hearing at the right time, and that is after the investigations have been complete and the reports have been published, rather than beforehand, as many called for. It's better to have all of the facts than to rely on speculation and educated guesses. And now that we do have the facts and the reports in hand, I want to revisit some of the initial assertions. On multiple occasions in the weeks after the derailment, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg connected the derailment to the withdrawal by the previous administration of an electronically controlled pneumatic, or ECP, braking rule, arguing the rules return in the wake of the derailment. Chair Hamady, you tweeted early on in your investigation that withdrawing this rule had no bearing on the East Palestine derailment. Did anything in your investigation change that assessment?
What I stated was ECP brakes had no bearing on this investigation, what happened in East Palestine.
Thank you. In fact, you went so far as to label Secretary Buttigieg's assertion on the withdrawal of the ECP rule as, quote, misinformation. Yet even after this admonition, Secretary Buttigieg continued to insist that this was a policy change needed to prevent another derailment like what we saw in East Palestine. Chair Hamady, does it make your job easier or harder when someone in a position of authority, like the Transportation Secretary, presses forward in making an initial snap, maybe political, misleading policy perception, even after being fact-checked as you did publicly?
Well, actually, at the time, I was agreeing with him because he was talking about improving rail safety, and he was talking about ECP brakes because people brought up that that the DOT should implement the rule on ECP brakes, and they didn't have the regulatory authority, and I was agreeing with him on that.
So in your public tweet on February 16th of 2023, you say that some are saying the ECP braking rule, if implemented, would have prevented this derailment. This is false, and here's why. You then went on to say, that leads me to my last point, anyone speculating about what happened, didn't happen, or should have happened is misleading a suffering community. Please stop misinformation. So are you...
I wasn't referring to the secretary.
Okay, very good. And then can you also talk about, earlier you talked about the need to go to the, or remove the, phase out the DOT 111 tank cars. Do you believe that there is manufacturing capacity to meet an earlier deadline? Should that be accelerated?
I am not an expert on the manufacturing capacity, but FRA has looked and PHMSA have looked at the manufacturing capacity for DOT 111 tank cars and whether they can be replaced.
And is there anyone else that would like to comment on the manufacturing capacity? Because I think sometimes what we tend to do in government is we issue these mandates to phase out or phase in certain things, but we don't always look at the manufacturing capacity to make sure that the markets have the ability to comply. Is there anyone that would like to comment on that?
If I could weigh in, I think the rail car industry has indicated that there is potential capacity to accelerate the deadline for finishing the phase out of DOT 111 cars for flammable liquids, potentially up to a year earlier. So we think that's the best data that is available right now.
Great. Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Sykes, who I believe is an original sponsor of this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I am. And I also want to say thank you to you and Ranking Member Wilson for holding this hearing today and allowing me to join you. It's, as you all know, been over a year since the Norfolk Southern train derailment completely upended the East Palestine community, a community that borders my district. And after more than a year of empty excuses and several requests from my offices and pleas from the people of East Palestine, we finally have a hearing on rail safety. However, I am disappointed to see today that the witness table is missing a representative from Norfolk Southern, the entity responsible for bringing us together today. Last month, the National Transportation Safety Board held a hearing to share the findings, probable cause, and policy recommendations from their year-and-a-half-long investigation into the derailment. This investigation confirmed that the probable cause of the derailment was a defective wheel bearing that was overheated. NTSB also provided detailed policy recommendations on how to address rail safety and close regulation gaps. And thank you for that, Chair Hamady. I want to make sure I take a moment to thank you and your team. While I was excited to hear that NTSB was successful in finding the root cause of this disastrous derailment, I was particularly disturbed with the contents of Chairwoman Hamidi's closing remarks at the board hearing. The Chairwoman's remarks detail a startling pattern of manipulation and destruction of investigation evidence, dishonesty towards investigators, and disregard for basic investigatory ethics that raise serious questions about the motives behind Norfolk Southern's actions during and after the derailment. Chairwoman Hamidi, could you please detail some of the unusual behavior that was exhibited by Norfolk Southern during your investigation? And have you ever witnessed anything like this before on your investigations?
We have not. This was unprecedented. Norfolk Southern, while open and transparent in providing us information we requested when we requested it, many times delayed providing our investigators who are here today timely access to that information. I had to call them about issuing subpoenas if we didn't get timely information. They manufactured evidence that had nothing to do with this derailment and tried to include it in the record of our investigation. When our investigator in charge told them no 3 times, he's here today, they went around our investigator in charge and tried to get our general counsel to approve that, who also denied them. Then they came to 5 presidential appointees, including me, asking us to overrule our investigator in charge and direct him to include evidence that was actually not evidence from this derailment in our investigation. And I could continue on, but it was unprecedented. Alan Shaw apologized and has committed to not do that again, not have Norfolk Southern do that again, because we had 11 open investigations involving Norfolk Southern. 4 of those are still open, including a safety culture investigation. So we still have to work with them, but his commitment is will be taken seriously. And if I sense that we go back to what occurred in East Palestine, I'm going to hold them accountable.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and hopefully this committee will do so as well. It is clear that through your investigation, additional questions have been raised about the actions of Norfolk Southern, and it is imperative that the American people have the opportunity to hear from Alan Shaw, President and CEO of Norfolk Southern, and for him to apologize on behalf of his company to the American people and specifically of the folks of East Palestine. So I do hope, Mr. Chair, that Mr. Shaw will be called before the full Transportation and Infrastructure Committee to answer questions regarding the derailment in East Palestine, in Norfolk Southern's participation in the NTSB investigation in the future, and we do have a letter to request that has been sent to the chairman of the full committee. We must additionally assure that rail corporations are fully held accountable for their actions that damage innocent communities and their lives. Across the political spectrum, we all agree on this from the Biden-Harris administration and previous. Common sense rail safety is a priority. In continuing with efforts to honor the will of the people and pass rail safety legislation, I'm glad to partner with Chairman Nels, Reps. Moulton, DeLuzio, and others on the Railroad Safety Enhancement Act, and this will help do many of those things that we've talked about in the Rail Safety Act as well as the Rail Act. But one provision that's not in this act but was in the Rail Act was the requirement of the safety placards on the train cars, which we heard an awful lot about. I know I am short on time, and maybe I will submit this in writing, but Madam Chairwoman, I do want to take any extra seconds they allow me to say thank you again to your team for being steadfast, unwilling to waver, and standing up for the people of Northeast Ohio. From the bottom of my heart and on behalf of Ohio's 13th Congressional District, I say thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your leadership on safety.
The gentlelady yields. I now recognize Mr. Molinaro for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for being here today, and certainly thank the chair for his leadership on this issue in today's hearing. Obviously, many of us all watched what occurred in East Palestine thinking, what if it was our communities? Not to diminish, obviously, the impact on those citizens and their communities, but to those of us who represent cities, towns, villages with similar rail traffic, all stood in horror and with great concern. I represent Binghamton, New York, and was not only concerned but alarmed. Could this happen in our neighborhood? The disaster in East Palestine, as we noted, and you all acknowledge, caused by a number of issues. My colleagues have gone through a good number of them today. One that frightened me in the aftermath and still concerns me today is the lack of communication and coordination between layers of government's response and, of course, the company itself. Chair Hamady, first, thank you and the NTSB for a tremendous amount of work. And I, too, appreciate the chairman's commitment to getting this information, the report done, the investigation completed, and then moving forward. I want to speak directly to the controlled burn and what NTSB found. Could you speak to the timeline for communication for deciding when the controlled burn should have occurred, as briefly as you could?
That was a decision not by NTSB.
Of course. No, but in your report.
Conversations, from our investigation, conversations related to the vent and burn from Norfolk Southern, its contractors, and Oxyvinyls, the shipper, began around the 4th, February 4th, February 5th. Oxyvinyls was on scene on the 5th, and already on the 5th, Norfolk Southern had begun to bring equipment in, planning a vent and burn before Incident Command or the governor had even signed off.
So Norfolk Southern makes the determination that that's the likely outcome. When and who finally made the decision to move forward with the controlled burn?
The information was provided to the incident commander, and the incident commander is a fire chief of East Palestine. But you make your decisions based on complete information, and unfortunately, Norfolk Southern withheld critical information from both him and the governor that could have led to a safer decision.
Having spent 30 years involved with local emergency response as a member of my volunteer fire department, and the last 12 years in emergency management, I know that the incident commander makes the decision, but it is clear to us that that individual was forced into making a decision absent some information. But do we believe that that individual, I understand that's officially the responsibility, do we believe that individual made that decision or was expected to make that decision?
The individual did make the decision. However, at the time, there was a false sense of urgency that Norfolk Southern and its contractors created. You can see it throughout the documentation. You can see it in news releases that were issued that were just not factually correct based on temperatures that were already falling and stabilizing on those tank cars. Unfortunately, they were misled in their decision-making. And in the end, Norfolk Southern gave the incident commander and the governor 13 minutes to make that final decision. And the incident commander had asked to go through the information over and over again and finally had to make the decision, but it was based on inaccurate, incomplete information.
Well, going back to the founding of this nation, emergency response is supposed to be led by emergency responders and no one else. In your report, you further speak to the lack of information and resource sharing at the emergency response level, whether or not those first responders have the adequate information to immediately respond, right, to the incident to begin with, and then information available to them to make choices on the ground. Can you touch on NTSB's recommendations for ensuring first responders have greater access to and are prepared to respond to incidents of this nature?
Yes, we've issued recommendations for a number of years regarding real train consist information, or real train consist information for emergency responders, which the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration already issued a final rule on. But in addition to that, we saw a need to highlight in our recommendations training, especially for volunteer firefighters, and radio interoperability, which was a big issue for responders.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know I'm over time. I just want to say since 9/11 of 2001, we have talked about interoperability and shared communication, and we have failed significantly even since. And it's a problem that really hamstrings emergency response. God bless and thank you.
Gentleman yields. I now recognize Ms. Titus for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for letting me sit in on this committee. You know, across the country, we've seen trains just grow in length. It's amazing to me now, Class 1 railroads are running trains that can be up to 4 miles long. Mr. Hines, I wonder if you would comment on, are those trains less safe? And does Smart 113 support the federal government having a larger role to play in the regulation of these trains, especially those that are carrying hazardous waste or hazardous material?
Well, I think anybody who's been blocked by a train can say that a 4-mile-long train is a problem. For obvious reasons, they cut cities in half, especially rural communities. One of these trains is stopped in that city, that town is cut in half. Emergency vehicles, you're having a heart attack, need to get to the hospital, it's on the other side of the train. Oh, well. So, you know, as far as just how obvious it is that it's a bad idea, it creates so much more force because the trains are so much heavier, they're longer, and the railroads think that if they put some distributive power in the middle of the train, that we're good to go. But what they don't report on and what's not collected is how often these knuckles break, and you know, the knuckles that hold the cars together, and the drawbars get pulled out, and this happens regularly. Another thing that would require to have two people to change a knuckle, you have to have an engineer, you have to have a conductor, a lot of this stuff. But it's just so strange to me that they just want bigger and bigger. Instead of running 2 trains, they're combining them into one train just by connecting them, or even 3 trains or more. So, and the derailment numbers don't go down. Even though they're running fewer trains, they're longer trains, and the derailment numbers don't go down. So, I mean, it's not a good idea for so many reasons. I don't want to burn up all your time, but.
That's all right. That's an important.
Congresswoman?
Yes.
May I add, we investigated a terrible tragedy involving 2 UP trains, a standing train and a moving train in Granite Canyon, Wyoming in 2018, and found the length of the train was an issue. It lost braking capabilities, emergency braking capabilities, as it crested a hill and went down and descended 13 miles. It was increasing in speed, all the while the train crews were trying to get braking back and put on the emergency braking. In the end, the train hit 55 miles an hour and slammed right into a UP standing train, and the locomotive engineer and conductor both died. And we found in that one of our findings was the length of that train was a factor, and it was 103 cars.
Congresswoman, as you know, there's no federal regulation that restricts train lengths. At FRA, under my watch, we made sure to collect data about train length so that the process is more transparent and we have data available to take action on that. Now, having said that, we're not waiting for the data to come in. We issued a safety advisory on train length. We've also issued a safety advisory on the makeup of trains, because that also factors into this. So we are taking the action that we can under the authorities that we have to address this situation, but communities are experiencing this, and we're not sitting idly by.
Okay, but you wouldn't oppose federal regulation or legislation to help you in that effort?
Based on data that we're gathering right now, it's something we should definitely take a look at.
Yeah, I think so. As you said, Mr. Hines, it's so obvious that, you know, it's kind of, you don't need the data and the explanation, but it's there to support that conclusion. Well, speaking of regulation, I know that the FRA finalized an important rule, and it's been mentioned before, about the 2-man crew. And I think these things kind of go together. And I've been pushing for a 2-man crew for several years now. And I know that a rule was finished, and it's somewhere in limbo out there. And I know in legislation we want to see a 2-man crew. It's a bipartisan issue. Administrator, would you comment on that, where that stands?
Yeah, Congresswoman, thank you for asking that question. I'm proud to be the administrator that got a final rule done on minimum crew size. It's a significant step forward for safety in the railroad industry. As you know, without that rule, railroads could go to one person or below without that rule in place. So it's an important step forward. I also know we've been talking about East Palestine. I'm confident in saying the community, the people who represent East Palestine, are much better knowing that there's more than one person, or there was more than one person on that crew.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
General Lady yields. I now recognize Mr. D'Esposito, original sponsor of the legislation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Aruga, throughout your testimony, you mentioned that carmen are under intense pressure to perform inspections quickly, often having to choose which components to inspect due to time constraints. With up to 15% of rail cars found to contain an FRA defect, how does limiting inspection time affect safety of the rail system as a whole?
Well, I would say, well, thank you for the question, Congressman. I would say much of what I've talked about today, which is that you can't put a time constraint on safety. If you do that, people are going to miss things, no matter who's actually inspecting the cars. But it's also important to make sure that the right person is inspecting the cars. I'm not sure if you were here earlier, but I printed off this. These are the regulations that the carmen are held to, or the standards that the carmen are held to, and these are the other crews. It's night and day, the amount they have to inspect to, the level, the regulatory standard. If you harass anybody to inspect too fast, they're going to miss things.
Right.
So it's kind of obvious.
And now, if I missed it, I apologize, but can you discuss or share with us any specific instances where inadequate inspection time has possibly led to an accident or a near miss?
Ooh, that would be hard for me to disclose because of the confidential nature of those things for my members, but I assure you I have plenty of stories, but I wouldn't want to really talk about them.
And now, can you describe what the effect of limiting the inspection time has on the workers and the morale?
Oh, it's incredibly depressing. As I mentioned earlier, imagine being hired to do a job and then being told not to do it. It's very insulting. You train all your life for this thing. You spend 3 years, 732 working days to go from an apprentice carman to a journeyman. And then when you get there, they say, if you find defects, we're going to discipline you. No more defects, no more defects. You get a target on your back, and it's not necessarily, for finding a defect that they're going to discipline you. It's for everything else. Your shoes untied. I've heard of guys getting written up for changing their hat over to a safety helmet. Wiping their safety glasses. Really just petty stuff. But that's what happens when you get a target on your back when you don't fall in line.
Okay. And now, you also mentioned in your testimony that FRA conducted a study that found that when inspectors were present, carmen averaged 1 minute and 44 seconds per car inspection. However, when inspectors were not present, carmen were only given about 44 seconds per car to inspect. What measures do you think could be implemented to ensure consistent safety practices?
Well, you could pass this law that would make it illegal to prohibit or to enforce any kind of time constraint upon the carman. As I've said before, you can't put a time constraint on safety. But I will also note, in the FRA study, there were remarks from specific FRA inspectors in there where they talked about, how this FRA inspector walked behind a carman doing his job. They found a whole bunch of defects, 10, 17, whatever, combined between the two of them in one train. And then he looks at the FRA inspector, pulls up the records of that railroad. In the previous 24 hours, they'd only found 3 the whole day. It's just not realistic. It's not the truth. So something's going on. And I really, this kind of type of legislation has been a long time coming.
Congressman, if I could just step in as the FRA administrator, when Mr. Aruka is talking about what the railroad, from his information, did, that's absolutely unacceptable. Anytime FRA sees that a railroad is gaming the system, is gaming the inspection process that we have, the oversight that we have, we're going to take action on that. There was a railroad that found out about our safety culture assessment and the questions that we were going to ask in that assessment. As soon as we found out, we withdrew that safety culture assessment of that railroad and made it clear that's unacceptable.
My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields. Are there any further questions from any members of the subcommittee that have not been recognized? Seeing none, we have votes here, if you can see on the screen. So this concludes our hearing for today. I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. I thought this was a very productive meeting, and this subcommittee stands adjourned.